Hello, boys and girls. Mrs. Butler here. I teach 5th grade reading and math, and today I am going to read to you a couple of chapters from our One School, One Book called Masterpiece. I'm so excited. Chapter 15, Hitching a Ride. It was nearly 7 o'clock by the time Carl, James, and Marvin returned to the Pompaday's apartment and provided Mrs. Pompaday with a plausible but not too detailed explanation of why James would need to make another visit to the Met that week. Carl described it as a private art tutorial and with the curator of drawings and prints, which managed to satisfy Mrs. Pompaday's hunkerings for special treatment, recognition of her child's distinction, and entree into the exclusive world of upper-class pursuits all at once. They agreed that Carl would come for James on Wednesday at 4 o'clock. When James finally retreated to the sanctuary of his bedroom, Marvin was frantic to return to the bosom of his own family. They would be beside themselves with worry. He had been gone overnight again, and the whole of the next day, and there was no way for them to know what had transpired. He hoisted himself over the lip of the jacket pocket and began to scurry down the boy's pant leg to the floor. James stopped him with his finger. "Here," he said, "let me help you. I don't know where you're going, but it's out in the hall somewhere, right? That's where you live?" Marvin sighed. How wonderful it would be if he could just explain to James where home was and hitch a ride straight there. It would take James mere seconds to cross the apartment to the kitchen cupboard, compared to the half hour or more it would take Marvin. Here was a truly bothersome inconvenience of being friends with someone you couldn't communicate with in any of the usual ways. But maybe James would figure something out. It seemed worth a try. At least he'd get as far as the hall. Marvin crawled onto James's knuckle and held tight as the boy walked towards the doorway. "Don't worry," James said. "I'll make sure nobody sees." He cracked the door and looked both ways. They could hear William bellowing in the kitchen, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah." "I'm coming, William," James called, smiling a little. James was unaccountably patient with William, Marvin thought, submitting to his hair pulling, and he picked up his dropped toys. None of the Beatles could understand it. "My mom's fixing dinner," James said to Marvin. "It's okay." He crouched and laid his finger on the smooth, polished floor next to the baseboard. "Here?" He watched Marvin. Marvin started to climb down, but then James said, "Hey, you know what? If you crawl to the end of my finger when I am in the right spot, I can put you down exactly where you need to be." He squatted back on his heels, grinning. "It'll be like a game, hot or cold, you know?" Marvin beamed up at him. James was so smart. He settled himself in the middle of James's finger and held on as the boy wandered down the hallway, pausing every few minutes and watching for Marvin's reaction. Marvin just sat tight. James stepped into the bathroom, then poked his head into his parents' room. "Not here," Marvin thought, shuddering. He couldn't imagine spending any more time than he absolutely was necessary with Mr. and Mrs. Pompaday. What a racket they made with their constant chatter, not to mention the frequent explosions. "Huh," James said. "I hope you get what I mean. You don't seem to be doing anything. Listen, if I am not close to where you live, why don't you crawl the other way, down my finger toward my hand, okay?" Marvin obligatorily crawled towards James's hand. James laughed out loud. "James, is that you? What's so funny?" Mrs. Pompaday stuck her head around the door from the kitchen. James immediately dropped his hand to his side, and Marvin held on for dear life. "Oh, nothing," James said. "I just saw something funny." Mrs. Pompaday looked at him suspiciously. Out here?" In the hall? I hope you weren't laughing at my Asperia statue. Marvin watched her cross to the hall table and tenderly lift a small, hand-carved wooden figurine of a naked woman dancing. I noticed some of your friends laughing at her during the party, but I trust you're more mature than that. The female body is a beautiful thing, James. James squirmed a little bit. I wasn't laughing at that, Mom. Well, good. Because you're an artist now, dear. You know to show appreciation for the art of different cultures. Even those silly old Eskimo sculptures your father has lying around. Why, when I think of your pretty drawings might be hanging in someone's parlor, it just gives me goosebumps. She swooped down and kissed the top of James's head. James stiffened in surprise and slid his hand behind his leg, shielding Marvin. When's dinner? He asked, clearly desperate to change the subject. 20 minutes, Mrs. Pompidou returned to the kitchen. James walked towards the living room. We're almost out of rooms, little guy. Here? He paused in the middle of the oriental rug, looking around. Marvin stayed close to his hand. See my dad's horse painting? James asked softly. Isn't it great? He walked closer, leaning over the couch to stare at it. James leaned towards it too, balancing lightly on his rear legs. The painting was bold and graceful, with its rush of bright blue color. You would never know it was a horse unless somebody told you. But once you knew it was a horse, it was impossible to see anything else. James glanced down at Marvin. Do you think I'll ever be able to make something like that? Probably not, he sighed. I mean, I can't even draw. You're the one who can. Marvin looked up at him sympathetically. But not without my ink set, right? James said, smiling suddenly. So it is like you need my help. He looked at his father's canvas again. But could you make a painting? I don't think so. Not one this big, anyways. It would take you years to do. We'd better stick to the small stuff. Marvin realized it was possible to have an entire conversation with James without even saying a word. There were beetles like that who did all the talking. But with James, it was like he did the listening too and filled in the gaps with what you knew you would say if you only could. Okay, dining room? James drifted thoughtfully through the archway. Marvin stayed put. I don't think you live in William's room. Did I tell you William ate a ladybug once? Yep, he did. He picked it up, popped it right into his mouth. My mom totally freaked out. Marvin shuddered as James continued. Let's try the kitchen, but we have to be careful because everybody is in there. As they turned to the kitchen, Marvin inched toward the middle of James's finger. James grinned. Okay, getting hotter, he whispered, tiptoeing into the room. Mrs. Pompidou was busy at the stove, stirring something with a metal spoon. Marvin crawled to the end of James's finger, and James swiftly bent and deposited him on the tile floor, close to the wall of the cupboards. Delighted at the ease and speed of the journey home, Marvin darted gratefully into the shadows. James? Mrs. Pompidou protested. Don't sneak up on me like that. I almost tripped over you. And what are you doing down there on the floor? I'm just tying my shoelace, James mumbled, but as Marvin disappeared inside the kitchen cupboard. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 15.